Channel 5 Network. This is Open Line.
Good evening and welcome to Open Line here on News Channel 5 Plus. I'm Chris Davis, a reporter here at News Channel 5, sitting in the big chair for the first time here on Open Line. But I'm excited because we have a really interesting topic tonight. H.R. 40 would establish a commission in Congress to study whether or not the United States should adopt slave reparations. And we've got a great set of guests with us tonight to kind of navigate this topic. We have Charlane Oliver, who is the Equity Alliance co-founder, along with her other co-founder, Tequila Johnson. Ladies, thanks so much for joining us tonight. I want to start with Charlane, if I can, because I understand, Charlane, you actually worked for Representative Jim Cooper at one point, so you have a good understanding of Congress. Give us an idea of what H.R. 40 would really do.
Yes, so thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me on. So yes, I in my former life, before taking on a full-time role with the Equity Alliance, I spent 2 years working for Congressman Jim Cooper, which is the Democratic congressman for Nashville. And I spent 2 years working in his district office, focusing on voting rights and criminal justice reform. So I have a little bit of understanding of how bills are made and how the inside, as they say, how the sausage gets made. So yes, H.R. 40 has been around for several years now, and it is finally gaining traction, especially in the wake of a lot of the racial reckoning that our country is having over the past year. And H.R. 40 would essentially establish a commission to study how reparations could be delivered to the African American community here in America. Basically, African descendants of slaves would be beneficiaries of any direct payment or reparations that we would receive from the federal government.
Absolutely. And I think, in Tequila, let's jump in with you here. So when you hear the phrase reparations, it sounds like, we can go in a lot of different directions with this. I've heard, direct payments. I've heard investing in communities. Kind of give your thoughts, Tequila, on what this might actually look like as it moves forward.
Of course. So I think that's why this legislation is so important, because it actually establishes what those reparations could and would look like. As Representative Lee stated at the meeting, at the judiciary hearing, reparations is not about just handing over checks to people. It is about repairing and restoring. And we are at a pivotal point in our country's history, or in our country's time and period, where people are starting to recognize not just Black people, because Black people have always recognized systemic racism and injustices because we've had to live with it. But now the light is being shined on those systemic injustices, And so now is a time for us to dig deeper. Are apologies needed? Do we need to talk about formal payment? Do we need to go beyond just the transatlantic slave trade and talk about redlining and all of the other things that came as a result of that? I think it's important. And, we are at a point where these conversations are pivotal.
Absolutely. Charlane, I'd love to ask you, and actually Tequila mentioned a little bit about the timing of this, but why do you think now is the necessary time to do this?
We're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of being in the coronavirus pandemic, where we've been stuck in our houses, and the only thing on the news right now is the COVID vaccine, the coronavirus, and the latest election that's happening. And so people are paying attention. We have time a little bit right now to focus our energy on what's happening on the television. And so that's how George Floyd's murder became to be such a pivotal moment for us in history, because people are at home thinking about and looking at someone spending and putting their knee on someone's neck for 8.5 minutes. And so right now is the time to act while people are paying attention, while we have the ear of the people who need it, which is white people who have spent decades denying Black folks the right and privilege of being full citizens in this country. So now is the time to act. We spent decades upon decades. The movement has never ended since we got in this country. The acts of resistance that have been done by slaves, by enslaved people, acts of resistance by abolitionists, acts of resistance by people after the Reconstruction era, after acts of resistance in the labor movement at the turn of the 1900s, acts of resistance with the civil rights movement. This has never stopped for Black people to get our full citizenship, and it's now time for white people to wake up to the movement that's happening and to act and get on board with this.
Tequila, I know one of the questions that our callers will probably ask, if not, right off the bat, and is a common critique when you talk about this topic is this isn't necessarily directed towards anybody that was directly involved in slavery in the moment. Current individuals in society on either side of this would not necessarily be the ones that were directly impacted by slavery. But I know the argument goes much more beyond that. Kind of explain to people why, this would be necessary and why this could be beneficial.
Yeah, I've heard that argument. In fact, in 2019, I went up to D.C. to lobby for reparations for H.R. 40. And one of the things that opposing sides say all the time is, well, I didn't own a slave. So am I going to be responsible for paying a debt that I did not, I didn't have anything to do with? And the reality is you may not have owned a slave or actively participated in the acts of slavery, but you still benefit from those systems. When you get in your car and you're driving and you're not threatened that you're going to be pulled over, you're still benefiting from those systems. When you go and apply for a home loan and you're given favorability because of the color of your skin, you're still benefiting from those systems. When you go to the voting booth and you're not worried about if your ID is going to be rejected, or you've been accused of something, or if you have an old outdated felony, and if you can vote or not, you're still benefiting from those systems. And if we really want to make America what we say it is, if we really want everybody to have equitable access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then equity means that we have to give up some of those things that we've benefited from to make sure that everyone has the same access to those opportunities. And right now, we know that that is not the case. And 2020 has exacerbated that. It has shined a light on it. Harvard did a study a couple months ago that came out and said if African Americans were given reparations, then the COVID deaths would have been reduced. That was a study that was put out at Harvard. So there are several studies out there that show that African Americans have been inequitably and unjustly impacted by the system, and reparations is not the stamp that's going to fix it, but H.R. 40 is a step that can get us to at least start having the conversations around what that restorative practice in this country could look like.
Charlane, I know that a big topic when you talk about reparations is generational wealth, but there'll be a lot of our viewers that are sitting at home thinking, you know what, I know my family, maybe in the Great Depression, was wiped out, monetarily, or a lot of families just have enough money after a loved one passes to get them buried and do funeral services and hardly any left over to be able to pass on to next generations. What would be your response to families that say, hey, we may be in just as dire economic situations as individuals that might benefit from these reparations?
Yes, and that very well may be true. We know that the systems that have oppressed Black people for centuries are the same systems that work against, poor people, poor working class people across all races, no matter where you live, what your zip code is, and what your job title is. So yes, that may very well be true, but we have to look at and understand how specifically Black Americans have been targeted and systematically designed to be locked out of policies that don't benefit us. And the federal government is very much complicit in us not having our generational wealth. So when you look at policies like the Homestead Act, that was passed. When you look at policies like the New Deal, those policies benefited largely 90% of white Americans. We literally gave over free land so that white people could own homes. So we have to think about, it's not a case-by-case basis for us as Americans. It's a systematic policy level change that has to happen, because the policies are that were put in place that over time blocked us out. And it's going to be policies that has to undo that harm. So yes, people may have, not have benefited from, on a case-by-case basis, but when we know that Black people have been at the bottom of every economic indicator of success, whether it's home ownership, the racial wealth gap, healthcare, jobs, all of that, when we help Black people, all boats will rise.
Absolutely. And Tequila, I don't want to jump too far ahead because I do realize that this resolution is just to set up a commission to study whether this is necessary and how it would look like. But in your mindset, how would this work? How do you think the collection of money to be able to prepare reparations would work? And on the flip side of that, how do you think it should be received?
So, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because right now America just passed a multi-trillion-dollar stimulus package. And so there is a model right there within itself for how we can use the tax systems that we have in place to get money to African descendants of slaves. We have a lot of tools and resources at our fingertips that we can use to make sure that people are, equitably compensated. And so that's one way. And if you want to talk about what it should look like, in my opinion, I think that it cannot just be a check. We cannot just say, let's just write checks to people and that's going to end it, because we know that the entire fabric of our country is ingrained in systemic racism and anti-Blackness. And so the first step is we have to acknowledge that there is actually harm that has been done. And I think that's really the premise of this bill, is like, let's first acknowledge that we have a race problem in this country. Let's acknowledge it. Let's issue a formal apology, and let's put our heads together and figure out how we can undo some of these wrongdoings. How can we right some of these wrongs that we've done? Is that going to happen overnight? No. Will it happen in my lifetime? I don't know. But we can we owe it to future generations to at least get the ball rolling. And like I said, we just passed the stimulus package. We see how we can get money and resources into the hands of businesses, communities, local municipalities, and individuals. So, how are we going to get people money? That's not an argument anymore, because everybody's at home waiting on their stimulus package right now. And we should be waiting on our reparations with that same enthusiasm.
I want to go ahead and jump to our callers now, because I know that our phone lines are starting to light up with some questions for you two ladies. So I want to go ahead and start with Frank. Let's go ahead and get you on the air, Frank. Can you hear us?
Yes, thank you for taking my call. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah, so my question is this. Is your guest advocating for reparations only for one group of people that suffered in this country, or is she willing to advocate for reparations for all groups of people, or any group of people that suffered civil rights violations?
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
The Black community and people that were enslaved, I've never been a slave owner. She was never a slave owner or a slave. I really feel like she's chasing a ghost rather than trying to deal with the actual problems. Nashville Mayor Cooper raised our property tax really high just now, and that's really hard for any middle class person in Nashville. How is she going to expect Black people, white people, any middle to low income person who owns a home in Nashville to be able to keep it when he's trying to price us out of here? We got a huge problem with our school system in Nashville, which is predominantly minorities. These are actual issues that we can grasp and deal with and fix, rather than chasing the phantom of being aggrieved by wrongs from 200 years ago. So I think this is just a grift honestly, it's a grist that she's engaging in, and I honestly think she's a racist, because I guarantee you she's not going to get out there and advocate for other groups of people that have been wronged to try to get them money. You know, a lot of Jewish people suffer something called the Holocaust, and which is probably the worst tragedy to ever happen on this planet. And they just don't complain to this level because they work past it. At some point, you just got to take responsibility for your life in the present and forget the ghost.
Frank, I'm gonna jump in because you gave a lot to address there. So, Charlane, it sounds like multiple parts to that question. Maybe to start with, you know, he mentioned, should this just be exclusive to members of one race? We can start there, and then obviously probably lots more that you want to address. Go ahead.
First of all, I advocate for all people to have a better life than what we are living right here in America. Okay, I advocate for all people, but I am a Black person, okay? I am Black, and that is my lived experiences since I've been born. And so what I can advocate for is my lived experience, and my lived experience tells me that I have been harmed, my people have been harmed, and my ancestors have been harmed. So the ghost that we are, quote, chasing lives with us today. The schools that he's talking about that are predominantly minority, ask yourself why. Ask yourself why those schools are minority led, because we have systematically underfunded public schools so that white students can flight to the suburbs and to the private schools. And now we got a state legislature that is trying to fund private schools with federal and state money through school vouchers. That's one. Two, he brought up the Holocaust. Let me tell you something. Every other oppressed and historical injustice that has happened in America at the hands of white people, every other group of people has received reparations and an apology. Holocaust got an apology. Holocaust to this day, the people who suffered through the Holocaust, yes, it was tragic. Yes, it was tragic. But we're talking about over 400 years of tragedy that has happened to Black ancestry. We're also talking about the Japanese. They got their reparations. They got an apology for those concentration camps. Native Americans. But nowhere has Black Americans, descendants of slavery, have received any kind of formal apology or any form of reparations. So yes, I'm going to advocate to the day I die for Black people to receive their reparations, because they never have gotten it.
A quick follow-up to that, Charlane, because you mentioned Japanese in internment camps in the United States of America receiving reparations. An argument I've heard just kind of out there. In fact, I think the Tennessee Lookout mentioned this in an article that they did recently. Part of the struggle, perhaps, with offering African-American reparations is it's at such a large scale versus for Japanese Americans, they were directly to family members that were impacted by this. So can you address that? I mean, obviously we are talking about a large scale as it's currently suggested how this program might work. So how do you address concerns like that?
How do I address concerns about
the scope, about the scope of being able to? Well, I think a common argument against reparations is just the fact that this would involve a large amount of population versus it was a little bit more finite with Japanese reparations and with the Holocaust as well.
It was absolutely finite with the Holocaust. We're talking about over a small period of time that the Holocaust happened, and a set number of people, right? But we're talking about over 400 years. This country is only a little over 200 years old. So we're talking about a country that was formed and built from the 1600s off of Black labor. Our whole economy was based off of free labor, and they never paid for that. They never paid us back for that free labor that they got. So yes, we are owed that. We are owed that, and our ancestry is owed that.
Let's go ahead and bring in another caller real quick. James, let me go ahead and punch you through. James, go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, I have a comment. If it wasn't for slavery, black people would still be in Africa starving to death.
Okay. We'll go ahead and have Tequila, if you want to address that question or comment.
Yeah, I don't know if that comment deserves me addressing it, but I will say to James, I suggest you travel a little bit. I just came back from Africa, and I can tell you that there are people in America that are starving just as well as there are people in other countries that are starving. So, if it weren't for slavery, who knows where black people would be? We don't know, because guess what? Our ancestors were stolen, brought here, and forced to work for free. And we still have not received the restoration or even the acknowledgement of harm. And I think these calls that we're getting is just even more reason why this commission needs to be established, because I think that we need to put some parameters around how we address the social ills, the harms, and the systemic injustices that have happened to black people, not just 400 years ago with slavery. It didn't stop there. It didn't stop with slavery. It's still going on now with mass incarceration. It's still going on now with the wealth gap. I mean, every social ill, coronavirus, every social ill you name, black people are still being impacted by. And that is because of we were brought here from Africa against our will. So, I don't even really know what to say to that, besides maybe you ought to get out of the country a little bit.
A follow-up to both of you. Both of you have mentioned an apology being a component of this, and I think that's something we haven't explored in depth just yet in this conversation. That is actually part of the wording of H.R. 40, is that the commission would look into how the reparations would work, but it would also look into whether and how to execute a national apology. Tequila, how do you think that should be addressed? If you were on the commission, would you like to see that done?
I'll say this as a black woman in America who has had to struggle with all of those social ills just to get a little bit of a leg up. I would like to push that question on white men. I would like for white America to figure out how an apology should be issued. I think oftentimes we harm communities, and then we look to those same communities to advocate for and to stand up for and to fix the wrongs that other groups have done to them. And I think this one is on America. I think it is on America to figure out how they issue an apology the same way they figured out how to enslave, how to unjustly harm, how to incarcerate, and how to, keep a whole race of people down for 400 plus years. I think it's time for them to figure out how to fix it.
All right, well, we have to fit in a break real quick, but our conversation will continue on the other side of this break. Stay with us. You're watching Open Line.